but he was also very much a failed human being who found it hard to believe God and his power, as we read. But Moses was pursued. God continued to pursue Moses. He revealed himself to Moses over and over again and used him in powerful ways. In that experience of the burning bush, that was God's invitation to Moses to become involved in what he was about to do. He wasn't saying to Moses, "You're going to do this." He was saying, "I am going to do this, and it's going to be accomplished through you." You see, God calls people to be involved in what he's doing, in what he's planning. You see, this invitation of God led his people, and it brought Moses to a crisis of belief. It brought them to a crisis and questions. "Oh God, I am not worthy. Oh God, what if they do not listen to me? Oh God, I'm not able to speak all that well. My speech is slow and stuttered." And to this God, it says in Exodus 4:14 and 15, it says, "Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, 'What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do.'" You see, God's invitation to Moses led to this point of decision, where Moses had to either follow God's will, what God was saying, or follow his own and decide not to do what God was asking him to do. It was a crisis of belief that required faith and action on Moses' part. You see, a crisis of belief isn't, like something that's crushing. The crisis is a crux. It's a decision point. Henry Blackaby, in a study called "Experiencing and Knowing the Will of God," which we did a number of years ago, he shared this statement, and that is that God's invitation for you to work with him always leads to a crisis of belief that requires faith and action. You see, this crisis was a turning point in Moses' walk with God. He had been raised in Pharaoh's court for 40 years, eating the best food, being educated by the finest teachers. He was, for all intents and purposes, a prince of Egypt. Nothing was held back from him. He was still a Hebrew, but he was a prince. And at about 40 years old, he saw that an Egyptian was beating up on a Hebrew man. And so he took matters into his own hands, and he decided, he ended up killing the Egyptian. He looked around and he didn't see anybody that saw it, so he buried the Egyptian. And the next day he's walking around and he sees two Hebrews that are fighting, and he starts to try to correct them, and one of them looks at him and says, "Are you going to kill me just like you did the Egyptian yesterday?" Well, that terrified him. He was frightened to death because he didn't think anybody knew about it. But if they knew, then the word was on the street, which would eventually get back to his stepdad, the Pharaoh, which would probably have some dire consequences for him because he had killed an Egyptian. And so he fled. He fled out into the desert. And he ended up coming across these women who were trying to water their sheep, and they were being chastised by these other gentlemen, and he stood up for them, watered their sheep, and word got back to the the shepherd who had those sheep. And he ended up marrying the guy's daughter and living in Midian for 40 years. So if you're good at math, you know that he's 80 years old now. God appears to him. He has been caring and looking after sheep for 40 years. He was privileged, and then for 40 years, and now he's been caring after sheep for 40 years, which isn't, sometimes you see pictures of it being such a romantic thing, or, beautiful, but sheep are nasty, dirty, and just cantankerous creatures. And he's been looking after these sheep for 40 years. Talk about humbly. Two very different experiences. And then God appears to him. He's out in the country and he sees this burning bush. He comes close and he hears God's voice. Moses, take off your shoes, for you're into holy ground. God appears to him and speaks to him. And God calls him to lead his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, into the promised land, into that land that's flowing with milk and honey. Talk about a crisis of belief. Talk about a decision point in someone's life. Talk about to lead or not to lead, to follow or not to follow. Henry Blackaby, he says this. He says, the word crisis comes from a word that means decision. The same Greek word is often translated judgment. The crisis of belief is a turning point when you must make a decision. You must decide what you believe about God. How you respond at this turning point will determine whether you go on to be involved with God in something God-sized that only God can do, or whether you will continue to go your own way and miss what God has purposed for your life. This is not a one-time experience. This is a daily experience. Think about your past week. There were opportunities this past week that God placed before you that you could follow him and do what he wanted you to do, or you could do what you wanted to do. There's always decisions to be made. And how we live our lives, how we act, how we react, is a testimony of what we believe about God. You see, Moses couldn't deliver the Israelites from Pharaoh's army, cross the Red Sea on dry ground, or provide water from a rock, or provide food. Moses had to have faith that the God who called him would do the things he said he would do. You see, one of the things we need to realize is that God is also calling each and every one of us who love him to join him in what he's doing. And this will lead to a crisis of belief in our lives, which will require adjusting our lives to what he is calling us to do. I'm going to go back about 6 years. Let's go 7, actually. I got a phone call from a gentleman. His name is Chris Taylor. And he asked me if I would be interested in coming and being interviewed at a small church called the Norton United Baptist Church. You have to figure something out here. I told God I don't want to go back to New Brunswick. The last place I wanted to live in was New Brunswick. I lived there for 3 years. I don't need to go back there. That was a crisis of belief. That was a decision point. Whether I sell my home, uproot my kids, move to New Brunswick with my family, follow God, or decide, no, I'm going to stay right where I am. I'm going to hunker down and put my feet into the sand, and I'm going to stay. Whether you want me to go or not, God. It was a decision point. It was a point where I had to choose. Because ultimately it was our choice. God was calling, but it was our choice to follow or not. 6 years later, I'm glad that God called me here. One thing that we figured out, though, is that our children probably will never go back to Nova Scotia again. I mean, my son is on Grand Manan. He owns a house now. He's already told me, I'm never buying another one ever again. Because he doesn't want to go through that process ever again. Our daughter's in Fredericton. You see, God brings us to points where we need to make decisions. We need to make decisions that He is calling us to make. And you know what? What happens when we join God in what He's doing, we need to make some major adjustments. Adele was talking about now Connell. Connell was saying, oh, I listen to my parents all the time, right? And she was calling him on that. Sometimes we need to make some major adjustments. Again, Henry Blackaby says you must make major adjustments in your life to join God in what He's doing, in what He's about to do. There was a young girl by the name of Kim. Kim was in the 2nd grade, and she began to realize that she needed to have Jesus in her life. She and her mother met with her pastor to talk about her feelings. And she vividly remembers accepting Christ in the pastor's study that day. And what Kim doesn't remember is when the joy of her salvation began to fade. It all happened so gradually. She took her first drink of alcohol when she was in junior high school. She was part of the in crowd and became popular. And by the 9th grade, Kim was considered a party girl. Little by little, Kim started pulling away from the youth group at church. And then she started giving her mother a hard time about going to church at all. And the whole family's attendance at church dwindled to almost nothing. More and more, Kim became part of the non-church going crowd. And late one Friday night, some of Kim's friends carried her into her house. She had passed out because she was so drunk. The next morning, she and her mother had a long talk. And her mother informed her that they were going to begin going to church again every Sunday, starting this Sunday. At first, Kim hated going back to church. Gradually, though, she looked forward to the events, and still, she didn't change her lifestyle outside of church. She was still the party girl. She just had one foot in both places. And then in the summer after her 10th grade, something happened that wasn't gradual. God broke into her life in a clear way. He spoke to her and showed her that she had to make a choice about which lifestyle she was going to follow. And when Kim talked to her youth pastor about her experience, he told her that she probably would lose some of her friends if she got serious about God again. He urged her to pray for more of the want to make the right decisions, to make the right changes. She said that she would. And God granted Kim's request by putting a desire for change into her heart. The change didn't happen overnight. In time, though, Kim was transformed by the renewing of her mind. She did lose some of her popularity at school, but she gained from that a respect among the people at the youth group, respect and honor amongst the folks that were in the church. And because Kim adjusted her life to God, what Satan meant for evil, God used for good. See, many of us want God to speak to us and tell us what to do. But we are not sure if we want to make any major adjustments in our lives. Biblically, that is impossible. Because every time God spoke to people in scriptures about something He wanted to do through them, they needed to change things. some major adjustments were necessary. They had to adjust their lives to God. Think about Abraham. He was an older man. God called him to leave his country and to go to another place. Think about Moses, who we're looking at today. I suspect he's pretty comfortable being a shepherd. He's 80 years old. I'm getting up there. I'm enjoying my children and my wife. And, he has everything there. We get kind of comfortable where we are a lot of times, whether it's good or bad. Think about Mary, Jesus' mother. She's a teenager. And God sends an angel and says, Mary, you're going to be the father of my son. And what is it that she says? Do you remember? May it be to me as you have said. She was willing to make the adjustments, to change. See, adjusting our life to God is a turning point in knowing and doing the will of God. Adjusting our lives to Him is when we choose to make those adjustments, to obey and to trust. But if we refuse to make the adjustment, we could miss out on what God has in store for our lives. Our church, our community. Think about that 7 years ago. If I would have said, thank you, Chris, but it's been nice talking to you, I'm not going to New Brunswick. Things would be quite a bit different, wouldn't they? You see, faith leads to action. Action results in adjustments and obedience. Moses could not stay on the backside of the desert and herd sheep and stand before Pharaoh at the same time. He had to change. What kind of adjustments might God be asking you to make in following Him? I've included a list behind me, just to spur your thoughts. Could be in your circumstances, where you are, home, job, school, community, in your relationships, friends, family. Could be in your commitments. Could be in your actions. How you pray, how you give, how you serve. And I suspect that in our beliefs, God is always calling me to go deeper with Him. God is always revealing stuff to me that causes me to think deeper and to change sometimes what I've thought, what I feel, what I hold dear. The list could go on, but in our walk with Jesus, He is always calling us to go deeper, to be more like Him. And you know what? To become more like Jesus, we need to change. Because I don't know about you, but I am not perfect. And I know that there are things that need to change in my life. But something that's really awesome, that blows my mind, is that when you come to the crisis and you make the choice and you make the change and the adjustments to be with God, you come to know God by experience as you obey Him and He accomplishes His work through you. When God invites us to join Him, we often want a sign. Lord, please provide this to me, and then I'll obey. Moses stood before the burning bush if it wasn't a sign enough. And he says, give me another one. Well, what about your staff? Throw it down. Well, what if, put your hand into your cloak, bring it back out, put it back in, bring it back out. But Lord, I can't speak all that well. Look now, come on. Here comes Aaron, your brother. Let's get her done. And God told Moses in Exodus 3:12, He said this. He said, this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Think about that. Think about that. God's sign was going to come after Moses obeyed. Most of the time, this is the case in Scripture. Affirmation comes after the obedience. Do you remember when the waters parted? They didn't part until he put the staff in the water. He needed to make that step of obedience. This verse says that you will know that I have sent you when you get there. Not right now, when you get there. When you get to the promised land. When you get to the mountain where you will worship me. You see, God's invitation for us to work with him, it leads to a crisis of belief where we need to make some major adjustments. And we will experience him as we adjust and as we live, as we come into alignment with him. You see, we can trust him. God is completely trustworthy. You can believe him. And because you love him and obey him, then you will have fellowship with him. And you'll come to know him in intimate ways, deeper experiences as we obey. See, the transformation that happened in Moses was that he was privileged, and then he was humbled, and then he came to lead. And he led for another 40 years. Moses was an old man when he died. He was 120 years old. And he went through a lot in those 40 years in the desert with those people. And I'm sure he had some doubts. But you know what? God walked with him through it. May we be those people that God uses in this community and live for him each and every day. Let's pause for prayer, and we're going to pray for where Kyle went and what's happening.